Welcome everyone who's already on board and those coming soon to this Labor Academy event, which we are hosting on behalf of the Urban Affairs Policy Committee of the Victorian branch of the Labor Party. And it's my pleasure to hand over to your host for tonight, Tony Dalton. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Janet, and welcome all. The first thing I'd like to do is just provide an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And then I'll just briefly I'll provide a few words of background about the Urban Affairs Policy Committee for those who are not familiar with this. But basically, what the Urban Affairs Policy Committee is one of about 14 policy committees elected every 4 years by state conference after a nomination process, and it then works on platform or policy proposals that we'd like to see move through into the platform for the next election. And this is a fair bit of work, which continues over basically 3 years leading into that fourth year. And that's what the Urban Affairs Policy Committee has been doing. It's been working on policy. That was taken to the August 2025 state conference and adopted, along with a lot of other policy recommendations put up by the other policy committees. That's then, as adopted, moving into the platform writing process, which is not done directly by the policy committees, but is done by a platform committee, and it's currently in session. That's chaired. It's made up equally of people from the administrative committee and politicians from the caucus. I think 7 of each, if I remember. They're then going through a writing process and a consultation process, and we're partway through that consultation process at the moment. On the 1st of May, the draft platform will be published online and will be accessible to delegates to the state conference, to currently elected delegates, who are then able to read and to put up amendments that will then go through another process. So that's and I guess we should really celebrate within the Victorian branch that we do have this sort of broad-based policy approach to policy, which is not always the case in other states at quite the same extent. And as far as I can see, my understanding of other more conservative parties doesn't have any of that. So that's the background to this. So we have a document that was passed by state conference. The process for this forum is that I sent this to 3 very experienced, knowledgeable people, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment, who I asked would look at what the housing policy part of this is, because this committee covers housing, planning and local government. And what we're doing tonight is focusing on the housing part of it. Although, as you'll see with what Pat Fensham has to say, some of the housing stuff, of course, you cannot separate out of the planning provisions. So that's and we've asked them, in a sense, they were briefed to say, have a look into this, see what really you think is important, and provide us some further background and some of the extra considerations that might be useful as we take this through, hopefully much of it into the platform. So that's the background, and now I'd like to introduce and I'm going to do this all in one go rather than breaking up the flow of presentations. I want to first of all introduce Pat Fensham, And Pat's a very experienced planner with about 30 years or more of experience in urban policy and related fields across a number of states and overseas. And his specialty really is metropolitan and local strategic planning, infrastructure planning, funding, housing and employment in relation to planning and regional and community economic development. I should also say that Pat is thinking about the next generation and he teaches and mentors young professionals in the field. Sarah Toohey, our second speaker, is CEO of the Community Housing Industry Association, and she's worked for many years now in the housing and homelessness sector around policy and advocacy. And has worked for one of the community housing associations, the Council for Homeless Persons and the Victorian Council of Social Service. She's been the campaign manager for Australians for Affordable Housing, and before coming to the Community Housing Industry Association, Sarah was senior advisor to the Minister for Housing, that is Richard Wynne, who retired at the last election, and was quite central to the process of working up the $5.3 billion big housing build, which is really one of the, a tremendous investment in the social housing sector in Victoria, which has progressed very well. And Sarah's now working with the community housing sector as CEO of CHIA to deliver over 4,000 new homes under the Big Housing Build program. So, Sarah, a lot of really relevant experience there. Hal Pawson is an emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales. And he's formerly Professor of Housing and Policy there at the City Futures Research Centre for over the last 5 or 6 years, and he's a member of the Academy of Social Sciences, which is a real recognition of his contribution. And he's published much research on many aspects of housing policy and market analysis. His latest co-authored book was so successful, it's now in its second edition, and it's titled Housing Policy in Australia, A Case for System Reform. So we've got each of those three speakers to take a peek inside our policy recommendations, to pick up those things that they think are important and begin to provide us with some more analysis and background about how we might progress those things. So with that, I'd like to introduce Pat Fensham to start proceedings.
Thanks very much, Tony, and thanks for the invitation to be amongst this group. A couple of very familiar faces actually there. Bernie and Louise know quite well. So lovely to see you and see everyone else in this group. And look, one of the aspects which Tony's captured in the policy spread there in this bucket of urban affairs, and then under that housing and planning, is the issue of land assembly and lot assembly to support new housing supply and new housing development in our established areas. So I'm going to be talking quite narrowly to that topic, and I had the fortunate position of really just grabbing something off the shelf here, which I've presented before in other forums, but I think you'll find it useful for this conversation. So I'll without further ado, I'll get on there and share. Can you see that, Tony?
Yes.
You can. Okay. All right. So this presentation is called Lot, Block and Precinct, and as it says there, the challenge of urban infill housing. I often say that Australia has spent 150 years or more in doing greenfields development. That's spreading our cities outward. And now we've got this big challenge of going inward. And how do we do that sensibly? So the Victorian government's got a target of 70% of new housing in the established areas of our city and 30% on the greenfields. And it's frankly struggling to achieve that split. And it's one of the reasons why we're falling short of our housing supply targets, because we're still pretty good at developing houses on the fringe, and that's soaks up some of the demand. But if we were much better at developing in our established areas, we'd have another quantum, another level of housing and different types of housing meeting the changing needs of our population. So I'm going to be talking about this issue of the challenge of urban infill housing. And so where we've done this infill housing in the past, we've tended to focus on what we call activity centres or strategic centres, and the government, some of you would be aware, Victorian government has a program now of refocusing development on activity centres. And typically the work that's been done up to date is very much focused on the main streets and the commercial, how to intensify the immediate locations closest to stations, and typically that's where the shops are. So if you can picture Moonee Ponds or Box Hill, that's the sort of intense development that we've seen in some limited centres over the last, say, 20 years. But it's typically been developing 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, so it's not a diversity of stock that we'd like to see. Now, the other thing we've seen is brownfield areas, or what we call in planning circles brownfield areas, and really this is the ex-industrial areas, which have used to be pocketed around the inner city areas. Industries moved to the suburbs or been restructured. And we don't see those activities anymore. So that's left the opportunity for the redevelopment of brownfield areas. And in both of those cases, you can see that quite often in those activity centres, there's large sites to work with. And certainly in the ex-industrial areas, they're typically large sites. So you can get a mix of development or you can get apartment development. And the best of it will include a little bit of open space and the like. But we're running out of opportunities to convert those ex-industrial areas. So, and there's pressure on the ones that are left to convert. And Janet, given the work that she's done in the past, will be aware of the Camperdown precinct near Richmond. That's a very, used to be an industrial area. It's converted into a sort of a mixed use area to some extent, but it's constantly under pressure to allow more residential development. But it's got a very important economic role still. So we're hanging on to some of these older industrial areas in the established parts of Melbourne and in inner Melbourne. But yeah, so the opportunities to continue doing that sort of development are becoming less. So the third place we're going to be looking is our established suburbs. And you can that image there on the right will be very familiar to you all. It's all over Melbourne. Is long, narrow blocks, suburban densities, low single detached houses on lots. But the big challenge, and it says there in the text there, is the lot as the building block is a key challenge. So we've just got very constrained building blocks to try to create precincts for housing, large precincts for housing. So typically we'll have 30 to 40 metre long blocks, and they might be 15 or 20 metres wide at best. Sometimes they're a lot narrower than that. But that's the building block we've got to work with. So we've got a problem. We need to, if we want to do building at scale, we can't rely on that lot by lot development. So I've got a nice little graphic here which sort of illustrates what I'm trying to talk about. So this is a block in Glenroy in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and you can see already that there's some action in this precinct that we're looking at. And so that would have been roughly the original built form, one house per lot. Each lot had its own dwelling, plenty of backyard cricket to be played, barbecue, space for the kids, classic sort of post-war development with a house and a large yard on these narrow, long lots. We've got a 270 metre wide street length there, quite a long distance. That's a good 5-minute walk or thereabouts, a bit less maybe, but it's a fair distance that we're talking about. And plenty of green trees, plenty of canopy, or at least plenty of potential for green trees. Now, what we saw in the 60s was we started to see some development of these lots with the classic sort of villa unit style development. Then we moved in through the 80s and 90s into double story semi-detached, and now we're getting these double story attached dwellings. And you can see what's happened. The lots are filling up, the trees are disappearing, the private open space is disappearing at the same time as the city's getting hotter and climate change is upon us. And then if we see that, that's more of the same. So the last of the detached dwellings disappears. And in terms of those different eras of development, there you go. That's the single story, semi-attached sort of villas that you can all imagine. And we're getting a little bit bigger, double story, semi-detached. Then we're getting 2-story attached, and we're starting to get really quite large developments. And just as a bit of an anecdote about how far the Victorian government's gone with its planning reforms, this is smaller than the envelope that will now be allowed in most parts of Melbourne without a plan, as a deemed to comply as of right type development. So, my argument about some of those reforms has been, well, it's pretty intense now. Why do you need to make it even easier, bigger and bigger envelopes of development? And so the outcome of uncoordinated lot by lot development is this picture. So 1 or 2 trees left, mature trees on private land, and the block's pretty well filled out. And if you look at some of the metrics on this, if you think about the starting state with a dwelling on each of these lots, roughly only about less than 20% of that area was built upon. And this is the days when we didn't have rompus rooms and backyard this and all the rest of it. So the houses were a bit more modest. The remaining space about 80%, and in this case there would have been 26 original dwellings on this site. Now, what we've had with the business as usual uncoordinated lot by lot development is, roughly what have we got there? A bit more than 3 times the dwellings. And this is my sort of rough guess that we're getting roughly 3.5 dwellings a lot. It gives us 91 dwellings, but the area that's built upon has crept up to where we're saying 47% here. If you just look at that, it looks more than that, but there's still narrow, smallish front yards, smallish backyards, but roughly half. And a lot of that, of course, the remaining space, the non-built upon space, is actually hard stand areas. So we're running out of deep soils for trees and for private open space, which is really has some amenity aspect. So that's where we've been on the left here. And that's where we're roughly going in terms of existing planning settings, and it won't be really changed, particularly by the reforms that the government's got through in terms of planning, except, of course, where a developer managed to get a couple of sites. Then they'll be looking at a different scale of development or a different type of development. And that, of course, happens as well. Developer will manage to negotiate with the next door neighbour, get that site and have a bigger development parcel. And if they're lucky, they might get 3. But that's still an uncoordinated process of development. We're waiting for the developer to get the next door site. The next door site might be hold out for a higher amount for their dwelling, etc. So it's not a planned outcome. It's just opportunistic if a developer can manage to get more than one development site. So, if in summary, then this business as usual development's not achieving the key elements of precinct urban design for desired future outcomes. And all of these dot points here are the things which us planners talk about all the time. We want to see diverse housing. We would like to see social and affordable housing. We'd like to see connectivity and walkability. We'd like to see additional local open space. We want high quality buildings. We want more tree canopy, and we want to achieve zero carbon. And incremental, uncoordinated lot by lot development is not enabling us to achieve any of these things. So we've got a dilemma. So the alternative, which we're where we've lost the alternative for this alternative in some cases, because this Glenroy block is already pretty well all gone. But let's picture where we might have been when there was individual houses on all of these lots. So the alternative is this master plan for the suburban block. So we identified this street to street lane as being very important in terms of providing walkability, connections, potentially a new frontage for housing. We think that through site connection there would be really important to have, because again, it gives us another street frontage, which enables a more diverse housing stock rather than these gun barrel developments which we're seeing all the way through this Glenroy block. Wouldn't it be nice to have this also, another street frontage here? This makes walkability in this area much more interesting. So if we want to go from here to here, instead of having to slog along this 270 metre frontage and then around the corner here, we can choose to go through this way, this way, this way, or this way, this way, and this way. So it's subtle stuff, but it's the stuff that urban designers and people think about place are really quite into, and it's really important in the quality of our places that we have these sort of alternatives. So that might be the new public domain which we're talking about, or the opportunities to move around this site in that way. Now, if we were redeveloping this block at quite intense development, we'd expect to see maybe a brand new park in this place here, right? So here's our new park. And then we've got some potential development parcels, which we're starting to think, okay, well, these are super lots, if you like, consisting of 4 to 5 of the original lots, and each of them could have an internal private open space, which would create some amenity. Picture Berlin, France. If you've been to those places where you've got your internal open space, there might be a playground in there, place for communal food, whatever, communal eating. And then we've broken up the lots into these 80 to 90 metre frontages or 50 to 60 metre frontages. And again, if you look at the urban design literature on these sort of distances are, get to some sort of ideal of what a block length and a block pattern might be. So we've now got a new open space of 1/4 of a hectare. We've got these precincts and parcels, and we can implement this over time if we've got this broad framework. So we might put in some terraces to begin with, some more density here, higher density nearer to the activity centre and the shops. Another sort of low scale apartment building around that private open space. And we're gradually filling in the streets here as well, getting this picture where we've got this ultimate outcome. Plenty of trees, density, a mix of housing, private open space, a big public open space, new ways of moving around around this block, this precinct or this block with all those original detached houses on it. So if you look again, you add this third box for the metrics here. So we've reduced the building footprint. We've increased the remaining share, that is the public and private open space, compared to this business as usual. And we've added a lot more dwellings, so I'm calculating that building footprint at 140 square metres each, which is pretty generous. So we've gone from 26 to 91 under business as usual, and then leapt up to 165. So instead of getting, roughly 3 to 1, we're getting more like 6 to 1, if compared to our original thing. So not only do we get more private and public open space, we actually get a greater yield by doing it in this master plan way. And when you think about the task, and you've got to look for Plan Victoria to see the sort of numbers that are being talked about for infill development, my fear is that unless we bite the bullet and start to think more creatively about this need to have coordinated lot assembly in our established areas, will fall well short of the ambition to have more housing in our near services and near good amenity and near our shops and transport. And again, just back of the envelope numbers, a little bit of property economics here. So before I talk to the stuff I'll talk to the stuff on the right-hand side here. So So here we go. Let's say there were these 26 original dwellings at $1 million each. So that's the existing use value. That's what EUV says. Now the business as usual. You'll sell your block of land if you can get 25% more maybe than the market is telling you, and under that business as usual approach, that's the case. So yes, if the developer knocks on the door, I'm prepared to sell my block. They're offering me 25% above the amount, but so I'll sell them at that price. But then under this planned or master planned approach, you don't need to pay any more for those sites to incentivize the sale, but the actual residual the residual land value of the whole development once developed is a lot higher, and that's where the potential comes for reinvesting that amount into the public domain and into the infrastructure in that area. So there's no margin in this marginal development outcome to actually reinvest any surplus into the site, whereas what I'm arguing here is that a master planned approach actually releases more value, or there's a greater value uplift, which at least gives you the potential to allocate that to the public domain and to the infrastructure you would need in the area. So here is the policy options, and these are roll off the tongue, but they're harder to do than they sound. But add to the existing planning tools, so you can tweak the planning tools to try to encourage or incentivize this sort of lot assembly which is going on. And to talk again to the government's reforms in the activity centres, they've said, well, you can do a higher development if you've got a site above a certain size. Can't remember what it is. It might be 1,000 square metres or 1,500 square metres. Someone might in this group might know. But what they're saying there is that's an attempt to say, well, we'll limit the height that you can go unless you get a big enough site, and that's meant to incentivise the market to buy the site next door, and then they get the bigger site and they can assemble it, and then they can get a bigger development. Create incentives and leverage from shared development rights, which is really what I'm saying. So you would need a system which sort of enables you to pool your development rights, and they'll be distributed differently across the site. So some parts might be higher density, some might be lower density, and we'll be creating open space in the middle, for example. But you wouldn't be disadvantaged by only having a 2-story development on your block compared to maybe an 8-story development. So that's a sort of the idea of sharing the density, sharing the development rights, and therefore leveraging an outcome. So, and then the third, which is really a greater interventionist version, which is to assemble and develop sites through either a neighbourhood or land development corporation. And if that sounds radical, it's not really, because it's in the powers of the Suburban Rail Loop Authority and it's in the powers of Development Victoria. And of course, Suburban Rail Loop Authority has liberally used that power when it comes to buying sites for transport construction. So when they need to build a new station precinct, they'll happily go and knock on doors and use their compulsory purchasing powers to do that. But we seem to have a threshold barrier to the idea of doing that to build housing. So that's the sort of the flip that a government needs to do in its head is to say, well, housing, greater housing in our infill areas at good yields represents a version of infrastructure as well, and we can deploy the land asset in that same way. But I've spoken to ministers who say, government buying houses to build more government buying existing private houses to build much more houses. That seems to be a mental leap that they're just incapable of getting there. And you can understand it's an argument that needs to be carefully worked through. But it's something about the community and the public seeing the purchase of land for infrastructure and transport as being fine and not for housing sites. So we have the power now. The Suburban Rail Loop Authorities Act is incredibly powerful in this area. They haven't used it for housing yet, but there's discussions going on about that. But I just think it's to achieve the sort of infill numbers that we need, we'll need to be having a much more interventionist agenda around the role of the likes of Development Victoria. And they need to be mandated to do it by the government, because they won't choose to do it given their current mandate and where they operate, unless they're given a mandate to do so. So I think that's it, Tony.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I might just mention that the policy recommendations adopted by a state conference do already include the proposition that the government empower an agency to do Strategy 3. That's whether it's Development Victoria or another agency doesn't really matter. It's about actually proactively enabling that land consolidation.
Yeah. Yep. Well, that's great, and I should have complimented you on the policy, Tony. It's good. It's certainly good work, and I was very happy to see that in there, I have to say.
Good. Thank you very much. We're now going to move to our second speaker, Sarah Toohey. Already introduced her, and she's going to share her screen and put up her presentation, which is going to focus around the social housing aspects of the policy. How are you going there, Sarah, in terms of sharing?
Good. I'm ready to go. Hang on. It says choose what app to share with us. That's not it. That's not it either. Let me try again. But Tony, I wanted to just flag, because it's a bit of a segue from Pat's presentation. I've just popped in the chat a project that we did with Swinburne University on site amalgamation for existing community housing properties. So what that project did was have a look at all our ageing community housing sites, where the lots around it were of a similar age, and what you could do with those sites. So if you're interested in Pat's work, there's another piece of work there that can actually allow that to, let's just try this.
And Sarah you and I were both on the panel when that was first aired, weren't we? And it's really excellent work.
Yes, yeah, it is a fantastic piece of work, and I would commend it to you. Now, what can people see? Can you see a slideshow there?
We can.
Fantastic. Yep. All right. Fabulous. So I'd start just saying thanks very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today about the platform. I would like to also echo Tony's acknowledgement of the traditional owners that we're all coming from, on the lands that we're all coming from, to today's meeting. So CHIA-Vic is the peak body for the community housing sector in Victoria. And so our role is to advocate for and support the community housing sector within the larger housing system, to ensure that all Victorians have the dignity of an appropriate, secure and affordable home. And in that vein, I wanted to focus squarely on recommendation 4, the recommendation around social housing provision, because this is actually, I think, a key and overlooked lever that government has when it's looking at housing supply and improving housing affordability. It's a direct investment that is a direct route between what government invests and does and securing affordability for people. So a lot of the debate at the moment, and housing supply is really important, but a lot of the debate is about supply as the mechanism to improve affordability, and it really is just a very blunt tool. So we do need to be looking at what I like to think of as a trickle-up approach, because by investing in social housing, it alleviates pressure on all the other rungs of the housing ladder above it. So that recommendation is absolutely critical, because we are in a pretty parlous state when it comes to the construction of social housing in Victoria. This chart's a pretty important one. I mean, it shows over the last 40 years that we've had a steady decline in social housing, which is it's no surprise that we find ourselves where we are in regards to social housing at the moment. But there's two sort of key moments in this graph that I want to draw your attention to. So around 96, 97, the Howard government expanded Commonwealth rent assistance and started retracting its capital funding for social housing. And so you can see there we sort of dropped from about 6% of all construction on average right down to under 2%, between 1% and 2% for that sort of decade or so. Then we've got the global financial crisis, and we had a huge investment from the Rudd government at the time in social housing. So that 2009 to 11 is a bit of a blip. But what the Rudd government also did at that time was reform federal financial relations and remove matching requirements from a whole bunch of Commonwealth state agreements. And in particular, it removed matching requirements around social housing funding. So essentially the idea was we'll move to a performance-based measure. We won't tell states how to use this money, and we'll remove all the matching requirements except for in homelessness services. And so what that led to in construction is that drop to under 1% in that next following decade, up to the coronavirus, the economic crisis around the coronavirus, and the $5.3 billion big housing build. We don't have a structural mechanism for the ongoing construction of social housing now. So the biggest impact strategy that as I see it in the platform is this one around establishing a consistent and long-term funding mechanism that expands the social housing stock in Victoria. And I think those words, I underlined and bolded them because consistent and long-term is key here. You don't turn around that graph that I just put up with these very big, very welcome, but short spurts of building activity that then drops. I think the important thing to note in this graph here is we have a big boost in the global financial crisis. We've dropped back down for a decade. We have a big boost in the coronavirus or big housing build. And, in a couple of years, in the next 2 years, in fact, the big housing build will come off and we'll see that drop again. So I've just also sort of did a bit of a calculation on what that 15% of new housing supply would need to look like, so what that sort of means in dwelling numbers. And so, if we just wanted to stay where we are at the moment, we'd need to be building about 2,000 homes a year. If we want to meet all the need that's out there as we look at it in the census, we need to be building about 26,000 social homes a year. But to get to this target in the platform of 15% of all new housing, that would be about just shy of 8,000 new homes a year. So that is more than we're building under the big house, or in the big housing build and Housing Australia Future Fund put together. If you look at that over a decade, that builds about 1,600 units a year. So we're looking at much higher multiples of funding to achieve that result. So I just wanted to have a look at the current funding environment and what that means. So I should also acknowledge we are, compared to where we've been in the last decade, we are in a much better place. So the big housing build in Victoria has made a huge difference. That's been topped up also by the Regional Housing Fund. We've got the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is going to have a huge injection of units right across the country. We are just in the final stages of the final funding round in that, though. So while those homes will be rolling out over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, the funding cycle for the time being from the Commonwealth Government will come to a close in the middle of the year when those contracts are awarded. So we are looking at that boom and bust graph again. The reason I've underlined these two points in this slide is that the Commonwealth Government spends around $5 billion a year in Commonwealth rent assistance, and the majority of that goes to private landlords, so about 91%. They also spend $1.8 billion in the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. So in Victoria, that equates to $460 million a year, but $100 million of that is quarantined for homelessness services. So if you look at that, about $360 million a year of Commonwealth funding is to go to the social housing system. What happens in practice is that very little of that goes into new construction. Most of it goes into maintenance and operations of the existing public housing portfolio. So I guess that's to say, aside from those big funding boosts, we don't have a core underlying funding structures that are designed to deliver growth in social housing. And so the right institutional settings to do that are key. And the platform identifies, I think, all the components that you need to support an expanded social housing system. So extending Commonwealth rent assistance to public housing is a really interesting idea. It would actually be able to you could then think of that as an operating subsidy to to the public housing system. If you were to do that, it would be really important to quarantine the money in the National Affordable Housing and Homelessness Agreement. Sorry, NASH is the acronym, National Affordable Social Housing and Homelessness Agreement, to quarantine that $360 million in Victoria for capital works alone. So if we're going to fund public housing with an operating subsidy, we need to look at how the core funding from the Commonwealth is then funneled into construction. The platform also looks at construction funding through capital grants, which is by far and away the cheapest way to deliver social housing, and low-cost finance, which has become a very important part of the housing mix, and it helps share the cost burden across. At the moment, it's used by the community housing sector to reduce the cost to government. And securing sites through government-owned land is very important as well. But how all of those elements work together is really critical. So I think I really liked recommendation 1.3 to have a national strategy with targets, but I would add in bold, it doesn't have to be bold in the platform, but I would add and agreed funding contributions for increasing the supply of social housing. Because as I referenced before, those reforms in 2009 sort of allowed states to walk back their contributions. And now there isn't a real systemic or transparent way to ensure that there's a co-contribution from states into the capital funding of social housing. So I wanted to go deep on the one recommendation that I thought was the most important and critical. There are other bits and pieces in the platform that I would love to comment on and discuss, and happy to go further in the discussion later. One of the ones I would flag is there was a recommendation around specialist disability accommodation and working with providers to ensure that it gets to people it needs to. I think that goes hand in hand with thinking about regulation around not just specialist disability providers, but all service providers under the NDIS, because that the preponderance of unregistered providers has led to that market looking like a bit of a Wild West. So that's my closing statement, and I will pass over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that contribution. Much appreciated. And finally, but not least, from Hal Pawson, and if you're able now, please, Hal, to share your screen.
Can I just say, Hal's put in the chat exactly what I was getting at.
Yep. And I think he's going to build nicely on your contribution, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tony. I'm hoping that's visible. Can you see my shared?
I think we can.
Screen? Great. Okay. So thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks to to Pat and to Sarah. Fantastic presentations. This one's very different again, a little bit of overlap about one or two of the points, but the kind of style of it is quite different. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and acknowledge that I'm speaking from land that has never been ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So what I'm going to do is just provide a few slightly random comments on different aspects of the policy platform that Tony and colleagues have put together, which is an incredibly impressive piece of work. There's so much very, very clearly specified detail there, in not, as Tony said, not just around housing, but planning and local government as well. But I would, so I'm not covering it in any comprehensive way, and neither am I going into one topic with huge depth like Pat, but I'm going to sort of work through 6 slides, just to reassure you that there's a limited amount of coverage here. But firstly, so most of the 5 of these slides refer to particular recommendations that are scattered throughout the document. But the first slide is not a recommendation. This slide is commenting on a comment or an observation, really, which is this observation that new housing supply is at a low level and must be increased, which is a comment near the beginning, and seems, very well in tune with the sort of zeitgeist about how expanding housing supply is the major thing that we all need to be doing, or all Australian governments. And if we can do that, then most other things will be solved, which I think needs to be tempered quite a lot. Certainly, I'm not disagreeing that maximising housing supply will, at some level, help to ease prices and rents, sure. But we do need to see this in context, because it is not a silver bullet. And improving housing affordability is going to come about in only a fairly small way through any realistically imaginable level of expanded housing supply that we possibly achieve. We have to do a lot of other things as well. We must be also pushing for complementary reforms as well, and this platform absolutely does that. But quite a lot of the time, the rhetoric that you get from particularly the Commonwealth is, really the major lever is planning reform and the greater supply that will result from it. And yeah, we're doing a few other things, but they're not very important. Yes, they are.
Hal, can I just interrupt for a moment? There's a request to see if you can actually push a button on your PowerPoint to show, which means that the text will become bigger. Wonderful.
Sorry, is that better?
Yep.
Okay.
There we go.
Apologies for that. Hopefully that's a bit more legible. So
yep.
I'm working through this slide to just hopefully draw your attention to a very important paper by UNSW colleague and formerly Swinburne colleague Andy Nygaard, whose recent modelling demonstrates, I think, very convincingly that yes, we could possibly we should be aspiring to expand housing supply, but even a very big step up in that, even maintained over a long period, would only improve affordability quite marginally. I mean, when I say a long period, 20 years. If we were able to achieve the 1.2 million homes per 5 years, which is the current national target, if we were able to do that consistently over 20 years, we would improve housing affordability a little bit, maybe by reducing the house price to income ratio from 8 to 7 or 7.5, but not very much, unless we're doing a lot of other things as well. So it's not by itself, even if we could do it, which is pretty hard to imagine, going to mean that we really don't have to worry about other things. We also, I think, need to remember that we have to think about quality as well as quantity, and just focusing on sacrificing everything else because we just need to get the numbers up is really not something we should recommend. And we certainly don't want unlimited sprawl at the urban fringe. We also don't want to deregulate or achieve greater quantity by deregulating or reducing building amenity standards, room size, or natural light rules. And we also don't. There's the issue of resistance to environmental sustainability standards, which many states have been really dragging their heels on. And I don't think it's justifiable to say, oh, well, that's a casualty of needing to produce more. And finally, just to draw your attention to the graph on the right, which is just to illustrate that Victoria appears to have been doing relatively well on overall housing supply, most of it being market housing over the last 5 years or over the last couple of years, and the projection for the current 5-year period makes it appear that Victoria may nearly achieve its proportionate target as a part of the 1.2 million homes. So I'll move on now to the recommendation on encouraging diverse and affordable housing in local planning schemes, and I think this is fairly uncontroversial. State governments have the capacity to help expand affordable non-market housing through the rules which they set, or the rules of the game which they set for local councils. And that's certainly something which is that's a recommendation in the platform, which certainly is a healthy one. So councils therefore would be encouraged or empowered to employ their land use planning powers, and this is perfectly common practice internationally. We haven't done as much of it in Australia as we could, but it's certainly an area where there is scope. And ultimately, the cost of requiring developers to incorporate affordable housing within market housing developments is borne by the land value. The developer will have to pay a lower price for the site, and that means that it doesn't really affect the end users at all, and shouldn't really impinge on the profit level of the developer either. So implementing that kind of policy does have the benefit of expanding affordable housing opportunities for low to moderate income households at no cost to government, and also promoting mixed communities at a local level. So if we go on then to the next recommendation. This one's around a strategic approach to housing at the national level. And this one's very close to my heart, as Tony knows. Tony and maybe one or two other people on the call perhaps as well, being signatories to an open letter that we all wrote, 117 of us, to the Federal Housing Minister a couple of years ago to call for a legislated approach to a national housing strategy of some kind, or the Albanese government calls it a National Housing and Homelessness Plan. And I think the argument for this is that housing is such a complex and interconnected system. It's a system where the policy levers are extremely fragmented across different levels of government, different departments of government within each different level. And therefore, the need for a joined-up long-term approach is also particularly important in the housing policy area compared with some others. And we do have in the bag, as it were, a commitment from the Albanese government when they came to power in 2022 that there would be a National Housing and Homelessness Plan, the first such thing ever in Australia. We haven't seen it appear yet. And I think it's a bit disappointing that it has disappeared from view. We don't know that it has disappeared. There's been no announcement that it's been killed off. So I think we remain maybe a little bit optimistic that at some point during this term of government it might appear. But it's certainly something that we feel ought to be. We should be still lobbying to encourage government to bring this forward. And one of the things that we think would make this stronger, though, is, as I said, making this a legislated commitment, putting a National Housing and Homelessness Plan or Strategy Act underneath it at the national level, And a model for that was brought forward in 2024 under Senator David Pocock and Kylie Tink, one of the Teals from representing one of the seats in Sydney, brought forward a private member's bill to do that. And their proposal was to incorporate these recommendations for the establishment of a 10-year strategy, and incorporating within that a human rights-centred approach to housing policy. And that proposal, the detail of that, was very much inspired by the example of Canada. From, as you'll see on the right, they do have a document called A National Housing Strategy, the first of its kind ever in Canada, published in 2017 and underpinned in 2019 by legislation. So the Canadian legislation to us seemed an extremely relevant point of reference, because Australian and Canadian governance are systems of the type of, not only are they both federal states, but they're extremely similar federal states. So we think that is something that gives us some sort of confidence that this is even possible in a country like Australia, where the national government, the federal government, constitutionally lacks a lot of the powers that centralized states, where in centralized states, a central government can just impose its will. So the third recommendation I'm going to just talk about very briefly is the one that Sarah's already mentioned, that national government should be committing to 15% of new housing supply as social or public and community housing. And I think, I'm not quite sure why the 15% number or where that came from, but I would say that it's extremely similar to a level that has been achieved in the past. It is not total pie in the sky, something that was maybe achieved in some European country at some point, but we've never seen anything like it in Australia. No, we have. In the early post-war period, around about 16% of all housing was public housing being built between 1945 and 1970. So it's about trying to recover that kind of level of production, which is far, far above even where it is now, but even more drastically above where it was in the 2010s. So we are doing a bit better in this in the current decade, and as Sarah said, that's a lot to do with states like Victoria. None of the other states have done it quite as big as Victoria, but most of the other states have followed Victoria's example at a slightly smaller scale. And then the federal government since 2022 has come to the party as well. And the graph on the right is trying to illustrate what the combined impact of all that will be. It will be somewhere around 4 to 5% of total house building will be social housing in the 2020s. And the blue line at the top of the graph and the dotted part of it on the right-hand side is illustrating that is going to help to push the total social housing stock up to around 450,000. But the orange line on the which is also on the graph is illustrating that, great though this is, it's enabling us to stop the decline. It's not going to do more than that at 4 to 5% of output. We would have to be doing even more to achieve anything like the sort of recovery in numbers or the proportionate share of social housing, which I think hopefully a lot of us on the call would feel is necessary. And just finally, I'm going to just mention some aspects of the platform which talk about Commonwealth Rent Assistance. There's 2 or 3 recommendations around Commonwealth Rent Assistance in the platform, but I'm going to refer to the one which is related in particular to the private rental sector. And on that, or in that context, there's this recommendation that all Australian households experiencing housing-related poverty in the private rented market receive adequate CRA assistance without regard to existing Centrelink income security entitlement categories. Now, what that's referring to is the way that eligibility for CRA is dependent on being in receipt of another social security payment. If you're a low-income worker and you don't have kids, and so therefore you're not entitled to family tax benefit A, then you can be extremely rentally stressed, but you don't qualify for any rent assistance, and that seems like a very inequitable aspect of the current rules. And in some of the points further down the slide here, I'm identifying some other, I think, important areas of I guess, defects in the current structure of housing benefit, which I think we could also beneficially call for reform, because at the moment, although the Albanese government increased maximum payment levels in an unprecedented way in 23 and 24, all good, but that was not reform. That was simply increasing expenditure. And I will stop sharing at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal. So we have 3 good presentations there, but housing, we can't cover everything in housing, but I think we've made a good start and picked out some key issues. Okay, I'm going to now draw this to a close and thank a few people. First of all, Janet and the Labor Academy providing the platform for this event. It's fantastic to be able to, as a policy committee, work with Labor Academy, and they've got the infrastructure. They've got a technical person sitting behind all this, which just really does take a lot of stress out of running this. And then to our 3 speakers that I think have really got people interested in a few bits of housing and planning policy. We can't, a session like this tonight, cover it all. We gave them the choice as to what they wanted to pick up and look at, and I think they've chosen well and stimulated some good thinking and questions from the audience. So thank you very much to the 3 of you. Well done. So,
thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thanks,
Tony. Hal and Sarah too. Lovely.
So thank you, and I guess good night.